Welcome to the JD Power Work at Home podcast. I'm Michael Vermillion with JD Power, and with me today are Mark Miller, leader of JD Power's customer service advisory practice, and Scott Killingsworth, senior director with JD Power's customer service advisory practice. Mark and Scott, welcome.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here again.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Good morning, everyone.
Hey, before we jump in, let's just spend a minute on why we are focused on work at home. JD Power, within our customer service intelligence practice, we measure and benchmark customer satisfaction with customer service and support interactions. We do that across many customers, many brands, many industries. And then over the years, we've actually extended our benchmarking to include operational and organizational best practices. So we know not only which companies are doing well, but how they do it. So this work at home focus is really an extension of our organizational best practices work. And our goal for this podcast is to highlight some of the organizational challenges of work at home. And hopefully we'll also point out some solutions. So with that in mind, let's jump in. We've got some great topics for today. Mark and Scott, let's start with topic number one, and that is around new hires. A recent article about a company that is addressing work at home issues, and one of their biggest concerns is how to develop cultural connections with new hires. The tenured employees already have connections. It's easier for them to maintain those connections through virtual happy hours and that kind of thing. But the real challenge that this company is thinking through are the new hires. So, Mark, let's start with you.
Yeah, it's a total problem, right? The notion of cultural continuity is nothing new. And then, work at home comes in and it adds another wrinkle to this thing. And, reading some of the articles out there, knowing what our best practice companies are doing, I think the watchword here is intentionality, right? You have to be very, very intentional inside the contact center environment, whether it's customer service or tech support, as an example, or sales. You oftentimes have the ability to communicate and create these bonds through proximity, right? Because what most people on the outside, not necessarily this audience, may not understand about customer service tech support organizations is that it's highly collaborative, and that normally is facilitated through proximity, i.e. you build relationships with those around you, you lean on those around you, and those are all gone. To the point of the article that you were talking about, it's without those relationships that happen naturally through proximity, you do have to be very specific. So we do like the idea and have seen, top performers do things like link up mentors and mentees and really, in essence, inculcate into the group. So this is the small customer service teams where you have a supervisor and maybe 10 to 20 people, that you're linking the more experienced folks up with the least experienced folks up. But that's one way to both develop and maintain those cultural connections by creating those relational connections. But Scott, do you have any thoughts on this as well in your experience?
Yeah, sure, Mark. What we've seen in top performing companies that we work with is that agent attrition is far less likely when solid business relationships are developed, not only with peers, Mark, like you were talking about, but really the most important relationship we've seen is with their direct supervisor. And the most critical time period is during the first 30 days, right? And especially when transitioning from a training period that's highly interactive, they have their peers in the training class in there. There's a lot of relationship building that goes on during that training time, and then when they start moving to taking calls, that kind of goes away. So that relationship with their supervisors really critical. And again, especially when transitioning from training to taking calls. So that period should certainly be a focus for relationship building.
Okay, thanks, guys. Second topic is coming from an interview with the chief people officer at Zillow. Really interesting article on how the organization initially resisted work at home and then actually changed to fully embracing it. One of the topics that I think is really relevant and timely with back to school is this idea of how can companies help working parents struggling with that balance between work at home and being a caregiver. Zillow actually is taking a three-phased approach, which we can talk about in a second. But just Mark, let's start with you on this one.
Yeah, and some of the points that they brought up, which are good and very much applicable to the environment of customer service tech support, is actual flexibility in the scheduling. And so, one of the frankly great advantages that many progressive companies have had is this notion of going out in a virtual environment, right? So this is not necessarily recruiting from your locale, but actively embracing a work at home environment as a strategy and taking advantage of an overstaffed situation with micro scheduling. So Scott can talk more about some of these other things. I want to just touch on this first part is that we would encourage all of our listeners to really kind of embrace this moment in time, because the inherent advantages of allowing work at home employees to work micro shifts of an hour here, 2 hours there, right, that fit right within their schedule, is a great advantage for hiring more college educated individuals. As an example, if you look at the work at home environment versus a brick and mortar environment back in the day when everyone wasn't work at home, you saw a vast disparity in essentially educational experience. The work at home people far outpaced those who were working in brick and mortar. And so the notion is that you go out, you find the best people for the job everywhere, and then you allow them to work the schedule that is best for them. And so now these orgs, you have this opportunity today to take some of those best practices in scheduling and WFM principles and start to work that in to how you best serve your clients. So it's a very good opportunity to kind of embrace this reality and actually turn it into a plus and a positive. Are some other thoughts here around, caregiver leave that's flexible? Scott and I have spent a lot of time in call centers, and some of the best companies that we had an opportunity to work with embraced that kind of that notion of offering more leave rather than less leave would yield lower attrition rates, much higher loyalty and engagement. So, Scott, did you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. I know we've mentioned attrition a couple of times, and attrition is very important driver of cost, but also customer satisfaction. Flexibility in scheduling has always been a request from customer service agents, and I know varying companies that we work with. Some have more flexibility than others, but it's been very difficult to manage due to the reality of scheduling for demand, but also scheduling in a brick and mortar environment, right? So folks have to physically drive. The call center has to be open and managed. So this work at home opportunity that has been given due to COVID gives both agents and companies more options. Mark, you mentioned some of them, like split shifts, the ability to volunteer for longer shifts, micro shifts, an hour here or there when needed, because workers don't have to commute. I would say that a danger is that it needs to be managed while it is a benefit and while you will likely see reduced attrition with more flexibility, that worker burnout is one danger, and that would certainly need to be managed. So I would just say keep that on your radar. Again, it's certainly advantage, but it could turn out to be detrimental for some workers who volunteer a little too much, right?
Yeah, thanks, guys. Good topic. Next up is an article from the New York Times entitled "The Pandemic of Work from Home Injuries." So, when we sent everybody to work at home, we didn't really give them a lot of instruction on best practices around ergonomics and so forth. And so, we have people working from their bed, off the couch, awkward kitchen counters. And so as a result, 92% of chiropractors say that patients are reporting more neck pain, back pain, or other issues since the stay-at-home guidance began. So, Mark and Scott, is this an issue that employers need to be, and then organizations need to be thinking about and being proactive about?
Yeah, Mike, in our, we had talked about this previously, and yes, the short answer is being disciplined and checking in really with your service providers who are at home, being active and coaching them on where they should sit, shouldn't sit. We had some companies, allow their employees to actually go back into the centers and pull out those chairs, which are designed to be sat on for a long period of time, do offer the ability to move, uh, and is set up to really help lower lumbar support and keep your neck in the right position, et cetera, et cetera. So the point here is a good one. You have to be intentional. And Scott, we have a work at home set of best practices, right? And this is just one of those areas that we cover in terms of practices that you really have to be intentional about as you move people to work at home.
Yeah, that's right, Mark. Companies put a lot of time, effort, energy into facilities design, right? There's companies out there building these centers. That's one of their big focus is to design it to allow agents to do their job and to do it safely, right? They're sitting all day. They're using, equipment on a repetitive basis. So, carpal tunnel syndrome and other repetitive stress injuries certainly happen. Uh, it's no less important when agents move to a work at home environment, but I'm not so sure that it's on every company's radar. I'm sure folks listening can relate, but the first item of business was to get everyone the ability to take calls. And I know there's stories of all the workers lined up to get their laptop in the parking lot. We sent them home. So the first thing was to answer the phone. I think now we've moved on to that. We need to be very intentional about some of the things we took for granted that just happened in our brick and mortar environment. Training needs to occur, for reducing these types of injuries. Home workspace audits and checklists needs to be put in place, if not already. But using a laptop in a variety of locations throughout a home that really weren't designed for that purpose can certainly lead to those injuries. So I say now that the triage has occurred, we're answering calls, we're doing it well. We've got some maybe months and months under our belt. Now we need to go back and focus on some of the basics, like the safety that was taken for granted when everyone was hired. All that training occurred and they had a well-designed workspace. So that certainly needs to be a focus.
Okay, final topic is we think a big one, an important one, and that is the impact of working from home on collaboration. So, a recent survey identified how working from home is impacting collaboration in three ways. One is the ability to meet and brainstorm. That's dropped an average of 11% since working from home began. The ability to maintain social relationships is another impact area. That's actually declined an average of 17%. And then finally, the ability to have unplanned interactions has really dropped the most at 25%. So, um, Mark and Scott, what do we have a silver bullet at this point on collaboration? We know that collaboration is important. We know that collaboration is suffering in the work from home environment. What's the answer here?
Yeah, and a word, intentionality, Mike. There, of course, as usual, there are no silver bullets, right? It's a combination of a series of decisions that are intentional around creating environments conducive to collaboration. When you look at this survey, and they really did a good job, right? So they tried to identify ways of working, right? They tried to identify characteristics of how one works and interacts with each other. And one of the things that I liked about it, the research in particular, was that they identified essentially this work social type, and they broke it up into sociable, networker, solo, and tribe. We don't have the time to get into it all here on this particular call, but I wanted to focus on tribe because this is a work social type that is most like what we had seen in traditional brick and mortar contact centers, and now we're transitioning to this work at home. And in this group is characterized by socializing closely with their team, but don't necessarily prioritize expanding those connections across the organization. And inside these call centers, that's your world, right? You're spending all of these hours with the team. And as I mentioned before, that was largely driven by proximity from a peer perspective or relationships that were formed with your new hire class. And as Scott mentioned, the most important relationship at all. And over the years, we've seen that the number one driver of attrition is actually a relationship with your supervisor. And so the point being is that you now in this environment have to, in essence, duplicate the relationships that were naturally forming through proximity, through the water cooler, the fact that you're off at break and lunch at very specific times and you know those people around you. All of that has to be intentionally duplicated in this environment. So that does mean, as I mentioned, intentionality. That does mean putting time into the schedule for mentor mentee relationship, as we mentioned in previous podcasts and in other webcasts. You absolutely positively have to have an interaction with folks at the beginning of the day and at the end of the day. And so those are some ways to help collaboration from a relational standpoint. So those are some food for thought. There's also technology that's involved additionally.
Yeah, Mark, I would say, the reality is that customer service organizations have to answer the phones first and foremost. So collaboration, whether in a brick and mortar environment or a work at home environment, has in some ways been at the mercy of the call queue status. So finding time for especially agents to collaborate, which is very important to help solve customer issues and internal process issues. It's been very difficult and it has to be balanced. I would say that the value of collaboration and finding time and a way to make it happen outweighs the impact of some degradation of service levels through potential increases in first call resolution that collaboration can bring. But I agree with you. There needs to certainly be a level of intentionality about it, and the understanding that there is specific benefit not only to the agents and supervisors to be involved and collaborate together, but also to improve customer satisfaction.
Yeah, Scott, that's a great point. I just wanted to, wrap that point up with the fact that, that is that's a specific practice that we look for, right? That we see over and over again in top performers. So this is us advising those listening on this call to ensure that you keep your scheduled coachings and you keep your scheduled check-ins, because as Scott mentioned, though there can be a direct degradation of service levels if you don't maintain due to enforcing this collaborative environment. Though you might see some degradation, it's totally worth it, right? We see over and over again that the top performers are insisting that those things that amount to relationship building, things like trust, all of that has direct payoffs as you try to execute new plans, ask folks to do things differently down the road. If you don't have the relationships and the trust that are built by maintaining these activities and actions that may short-term hurt a service level, if you don't do that, then you definitely pay for it down the road with attrition, poor execution, etc. So it's one of those practical things that, again, you have to be intentional about it. But a great question, Mike, for sure.
Okay, well, that's going to wrap it up for this time. Mark and Scott, thanks for joining us today. And thanks to our listeners as well. To learn more about the JD Power Customer Service Advisory practice, please visit us on the web at jdpower.com/business. And we'll see you next time.